Good day. Today I'm going to continue my videos on teaching styles, and I'm going to discuss the teacher who I call the entertainer. I started off at a technical college called the Isidingo Technical College. It was on the eastern side of Johannesburg, what we call the East Rand. And I had come from a very academic background, and I was now in a situation where I was teaching technically oriented subjects. Even though it was mathematics and science, they had a very strong slant toward the technical side of things, the technical applications. So I very, very quickly realized that I was a bit like a fish out of water, and that I needed to recalibrate, and that the way I had been taught mathematics and the way I had learned mathematics and science was different to what my students actually needed. So I decided to take on this endeavor, and one of the subjects I needed to do was called Strength of Materials N5. And it so happened that when the N5s received their Strength of Materials N5 lecture, that I was free. So I went to the lecturer. His name was Tommy R. And I asked Tommy, well, do you mind if I attend your lectures? It's going to be easier for me to study the subject and learn from you than to learn straight out of a textbook. And he was a guy with a big heart. And he said, yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Now, Tommy R. was an interesting guy. He grew up, as he described it, on the wrong side of the railway line in Nigel. And he was a tough guy. And he had been a real rebel in his day. He had run away from home, started working when I think he was a little over 16, and he was a man of the world. He definitely had lived life. And he had this way of walking. He almost leant backwards, but he was very agile. I found out later on that he was a martial artist, which it made sense. But he looked like a ducktail. He had this hair that was combed back, and he would have fitted the part in a Grease movie. And he was really a real character, but a very nice guy and a very knowledgeable lecturer, a very experienced lecturer. So I remember my first lesson with him. I sat at the back of the class, and he walked in, and the students were all there, and he introduced himself, and I remember he started teaching beams. And I'd never done the theory of beams before, so I was pretty clueless. And he started off, and it wasn't even 5 minutes into the lesson, and he had all of us laughing. He had the most amazing sense of humor, and he kept on throwing the jokes. Now, I'm not one who believes that you should always be joking, but he kept the momentum of the lesson going. And what came out of my 3 months in Tommy R's classes, which I then passed. I passed Strengths of Materials N5 thanks to him. And he was always willing to help me outside of class time when I struggled with certain concepts of structures. Was that he had an amazing body of experience in where that which he was teaching was used in the real world. But he had personal experience with it. I remember one of the lessons he spoke about cantilevers, where you have a beam that's supported only on one side. And he spoke about how he was once involved on a construction site involved in building a dam wall, and explained the ins and the outs of a cantilever, and not that you'd think there'd be a cantilever on a dam wall, but in the construction of it, there was a part where there was a cantilever. And I'll never forget that. And that was 30 years ago. But what stood out for me was the reaction and the engagement from his students. These were students from a very, very different background. They were all students of color from the Davidton Township. He was a white Afrikaans teacher. He was, at that stage, he was in his late 40s. And he was one of these guys that, he didn't pretend who he was, pretend to be something he wasn't. He was what you saw with Tommy R. That's who Tommy R. was. But his students hung on every word of his, and he would very quickly take what he was teaching and then put it into their context, relate it to their context, and then make it relevant to real world applications. And I remember sitting in his class one day and going, I want to be like this teacher. That's the kind of teacher I want to be. I obviously would never be Tommy R, but what I meant is that I wanted to be that kind of teacher that inspired my students to love learning, and that they got it, why they were studying this particular content, that it wasn't abstract. The value of it wasn't abstract. And it was a very mathematical course. There was a lot of mathematics and there was a lot of physics, and it was really challenging. But he also had the ability, once again, to take complex concepts, complex techniques, and to, as a master, simplify them. But he really was entertaining in the way he did it. He always had a joke. If, for instance, he did a beam, he was doing a beam problem, he would take one of the students and say, okay, Sipho, you're standing there on this slab and you are a load. And Nande, you're standing on another part of the load, you're another load on this particular structure. And he included them. And that was a big lesson for me, because he made his lessons exciting. He made his lessons appealing. He was an entertainer, but he had the balance. The rigor was there, the skill was there, but there was always this flow because of his sharp wit and the way he tied in his huge experience in industry into his lessons. And I asked him one day, I said to him, I'm thoroughly enjoying this course with you. Are all the stories you're telling, are they true? And he said to me, definitely. He says, I was a nomad. He says, I often left jobs and just didn't go back, not even telling them, because I was upset with the foreman. And he said, when I was younger, and he said, so I worked all over. I worked in foundries, and I worked in construction projects, and I worked in power stations. And there too was another lesson for me, in that I realized that the fact that he had such a massive framework of experience, he was able to bring it in an authentic way into his classes. And I embraced that. And so, as a very young, inexperienced teacher, I decided I was going to go out and try and experience as much as possible of that which was relevant to what I was teaching. The applications of science, the applications of mathematics in the real world. And so I've spent the last 30 years of my teaching career grabbing every opportunity that came my way to see where my subjects are used in the real world, and not only for me, but also for my students. So where I initially was using it to build my experience, I eventually realized that I needed to share it with my students. So, Tommy R., you were the entertainer, and 30 years on, I still remember your lessons, and you shaped me as a teacher, and I'm going to be forever grateful for that. And it really did correlate with his personality. Not everyone is as comical as what Tommy R was. He was a character. He was the only member of staff that pulled in a 944 Porsche because he had a sideline business where he made lots of money. And he was really cool. He had worked very hard for what he had. He was a character. But the entertainer, I learned so much from him. And I hope that in this video that the message that gets carried across to you is that we should always be looking to make that which we teach appealing to our students. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this. Bye-bye.